Hi.
Hi, Keri. How you doing?
Well, I'm just dandy, thank you. Today we get to do one of my favorite things. We get to speak with an author.
Yahoo! And we have to give a shout out to our fabulous producer, Sadie, who was doing what many of us do, scrolling the old social media, probably on the Insta, and came across Marcy Lane, who had just written a book called A Mercy of Widows, which put together a bunch of our favorite topics these days: dying, death, loss, and grief, women, death doulas, all in the context of medical assistance in dying. And she said, let's give this a read. And really, how could we resist?
Resistance was futile. There was too much there that was captivating. I love that we formed our own little book club and that we are going to get a chance today to pay homage to Marcy Lane, but really talk to her about motivations, about processes, and really where she might be going next as I think Canada's first MAiD novelist in Canada, somebody who's writing fiction about MAiD. I mean, this is big stuff.
And I'm going to be totally honest, I don't necessarily like to mix my light fiction reading with my work, because I read enough about dying, death, loss, and grief. But I took a chance on this one because Sadie said we should. And I'm really glad I did. And I'm super excited to talk to Marcy Lane.
Let's do it.
Welcome, Marcy. It is lovely to meet you via Zoom, and welcome to the podcast. Before we get rocking and rolling, could you take a minute and introduce yourself to our listeners, please?
Well, that's actually a pretty tough question, I find. I just turned 60, and so I've got lots of years of living. I am a new writer. I finally gave myself permission in late middle age to fulfill a childhood dream to become a novelist. You can thank the pandemic for that because it finally gave me the time and the solitude to figure it out. And before adopting the writer's mantle, I had a full-time job, including a long-term tenure as an executive director in a nonprofit organization. I've always been a student of the human experience. I studied politics and history in school. And then, as a novelist, I've been trying to figure out why people do what they do. My first novel is a very personal endeavor. It's a loose reflection on my own journey through grief and growth after losing my husband to cancer.
And congratulations on that new novel. 2023 is when it was published. I love to hear stories of people who made really good, productive use of their time during COVID. And your novel, A Mercy of Widows, I have to do a shout out to our producer, Sadie, who brought the book to our attention. I think she had found you on Instagram, and she said, I think we should read this. I think we should see what a piece of fiction looks like about medical assistance in dying and check it out. And so all three of us had a wee bit of a book club kind of thing happening. And I'm interested, MAiD is a very real piece of legislation. As you've mentioned, you're someone who has deep and probably extensive experience with grief, having accompanied your partner through a cancer diagnosis. So what inspired you to engage with it from a fiction lens?
Well, I didn't want to write a memoir. And so part of the reason I didn't want to write a memoir is that my protagonist had to get into far more trouble than I ever could. And so, there's an adage somewhere that says that the job of a novelist is to put their main character, their protagonist, up a tree and to throw stones at her until she figures out how to come down again. And I like to say that Hetty was a little hard of learning in that regard. And so why did I write a debut about MAiD? Well, before MAiD, I had several loved ones die. Some of their deaths were sudden. One was a brain aneurysm. Several were heart attacks. But unfortunately, lots of those deaths were also prolonged and difficult and painful, usually cancer-related. And when MAiD came on the scene, giving the dying people more control, I asked myself, how does this change grief? And so the fictionalized version of that was my exploration of how MAiD impacted grief and the people who were left behind.
Thank you for that. A couple of things. First off, I would like to think I would be friends with Hetty. I really enjoyed her as a character, and I figured that the author must be equally as spirited. And also, we're going to work really hard not to give away any spoilers of this great book, but a lover of dogs. And next to Hetty, my favorite character, of course, was Fella, who is a dog. And I have my own dog. But one of the things that really struck me, Marcy, about the way you wrote about grief, and I have the privilege of doing some work with the Canadian Grief Alliance. And so, how grief is portrayed in movies and music and literature is something that I look at very closely. And I have to say, I really appreciated how you wrote about grief, how it was individualized, and you got to see a couple of different snippets of how people might engage with grief or not engage with grief, depending on sort of where they were. And you really drove home the message that the 5 stages of grief is not where we're at anymore. And I think we need to see more of that. And I know a group of us have been talking about Taylor Swift's new launch on Apple Music about linking her upcoming album with the 5 stages of grief. And we're like, whoa, no, T-Swizzle. And Marcy, it was so nice to see that this was not the case in your novel, which, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'm somebody who wrote a book, a nonfiction book, and I just think that the depth of writing, the character development that needs to go into something that is fictional, that you're creating and crafting that, and alongside something that as Canadians, we're all really learning about, which is the MAiD legislation, and it's evolving, growing, and changing. To do that simultaneously must have been quite challenging for you.
It was challenging, especially every time the government enacted amendments to legislation. I would develop a plot that would be around the old legislation, and then they would change it, and so I'd have to go back and try to fix it because I wanted the story to be current.
I have to say, I was kind of wondering about that and thinking about what kind of timeline would this be, because when we read it, it was current. And so, okay, that explains how that worked.
Yeah, thank you. Those were revisions. Lots of revisions.
Yes. And I just think we are kind of revising and growing our understanding of medical assistance in dying and how the legislation can be used. And so, yeah, lots of revisions, both from a fictional piece of writing, but also in terms of social policy. And I would say how our healthcare system needs to react and how we as individuals react as well.
Yes.
Marcy, so again, no spoilers, but I would not want to be friends with Stanley. Don't want to be his friend. No thank you, no merci. I am a huge English lit grammar nerd, and I love your title of your novel for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that I love collective nouns. I love to find out what is the collective noun for a gaggle of widows. So I loved what you did there because the play on words, of course, is this idea about mercy and its connection to an assisted death that people might not be afforded a more merciful situation, etc., if they face a natural death. The other thing that I really wanted to, so this is kind of a two-parter, is I am a writer of fiction, but also of memoir and experiential stuff. But I really believe that fiction is a lot about real life and that we call it fiction, but of course we're writing, as you say, from experience, from our perceptions of what is, what might be, what could be, etc. I also want to kind of reinforce what Kathy said about Hetty, your first-person narrator, because she's reliable for me because she's flawed. And I think that's perhaps what you were getting at the beginning of our conversation, that, perhaps Hetty could run a bit more rampant in the whole situation than you would in a real space of life. And as a result, gets herself into some trouble and some conflict and learns while she goes, which of course is what we're supposed to do as squishy humans. Can you talk a little bit about how you came up with the title for your novel, but also how you curated that relationship with Hetty as the the writing of the novel progressed? I'm really curious about that.
the title itself came as a flash of inspiration. I had gone through at least a half dozen different titles, some of which were clever, some of which weren't. And it was truly a flash of inspiration. I was with a writing group at the time, and one of my jobs was to print off the entire manuscript of my draft. And at the very last minute, I decided, I don't like the working title anymore. I'm going to try this. And so that's what I did. And like throughout, I tried to make Heidi the source of some humor, because the topics of death and disease and dying and grief and assisted dying, they're all pretty heavy. And so I needed to balance that a bit with some stuff that was a little more lighthearted. So that's why Heidi she uses all people's goofy nicknames. That's why she doodles her jury notes. And it's also why she is so fond of collective nouns and etymologies and so on. And she uses that to amuse the children in her life, but she also uses it to amuse herself. And she focuses on animals mostly because she has a stronger predilection for animals than she does generally for people.
Which is definitely one more reason why I really liked her, because I could really relate to that, especially since, the way I'm often curious about how novels come about, but whether Hetty was leading you or whether you were leading her or whether it was really a dance of both of those things. But I found it interesting that she encounters some pretty unpleasant human beings in the course of the novel. And so I appreciate that those things really, really come to fruition for the reader.
Yeah. I believe that widows have a unique perspective due to our intimate experience with death. And I believe that the term a mercy of widows kind of underscores that compassion that I think our lived experience creates or can create.
I love that. And when I think about some of the research that Keri Lynn and I have been doing with people who've accompanied someone who used MAiD at the end of life, our research participants tend to be women who are willing and generous and able to share their experiences. And so I had no problem seeing that mercy of widows kind of piece, a group of women who come together to unpack, support, and care for each other in difficult times. And that leads me to Hetty's bestie as well. I would also have a drink with. I really liked her. And I also really liked the fact that I don't think I'm giving any spoilers here, that you made her a death doula. And you made her a death doula as a career change, which is also really real and resonates because I've heard a number of death doulas in what I call the deathy community saying, yeah, I used to do this before I did this, and now this is what I'm doing. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about death doulas?
Well, I think that they have a very difficult job. And I'm glad that there's somebody there that knows the system and can help people navigate the system in a way that is effective, because most people don't have to deal with death very often, right? Like the individual who is dying deals with it once. And so having somebody to help navigate that, I think, is hugely important. I think people will make so many mistakes if they don't have expert guidance, and mistakes that somebody, probably not the dying, but somebody will regret.
And I also think it frees up friends and family to be friends and family and not have to be the chief advocate, the breaker down of the barriers that we often find in our healthcare system, but rather do what they do best and love their person.
Yeah, very important.
I also really appreciated that there were children, the littles that Keri Lynn calls them, all throughout the book. The bestie has 2 daughters. Why did you include kids as part of this when I think you could have had a very robust book solely with the friendship, Danley, who we're not going to talk a whole bunch about because we didn't like him, and the court scenes. There was a lot there. Why was it important to you to include kids?
It was important to include kids mostly because it was full cycle. So children are sort of the beginning of the cycle, and then, of course, people dying is the end of the cycle. And I wanted to see the whole development. And kids tend to have a different perspective on death, and these children do have a perspective on death, and I wanted to share that.
Yeah, Marcy, I really appreciated that too, and I'm really pleased that Kathy's brought that up just now. I do work with littles, and I think they do very much navigate dying, death, and loss in their own ways, individual to who they are as squishy little humans. But generally, my time at grief camp has taught me that we learn a lot. I learn a lot from being at grief camp, just observing them get on with, I think, the really sort of community public health approach to grief. Kids are very good at supporting others who grieve. And I think we adults could really learn a lot from them. Yeah. So I am an auditory learner. I'm an educator. And of course, I craft my lessons so that I appeal to the visual, the kinesthetic, the auditory learner. I learn this way. And so I was so excited to see that you, in 2024, this year, released a copy of your book as an audiobook, and you used artificial intelligence. You used AI, I'm presuming AI software, to make the book come to life, which is really cool because now I can hear Hetty's voice in my head, which is really cool. Why did you go with the AI format? Why not just yourself reading the book or an actor just reading all the parts of the book? And what was the process like working with AI?
Well, it was a labor of love. It required a lot of persistence. I did try to read it myself. I managed to get through all 65 chapters. I went and processed it, and it was a disaster. I was never very good at acting, and I think it probably would have been just fine if it were a nonfiction book. Because it's a novel, I just couldn't get different voices. Everybody wasn't distinguishable enough. So, and I couldn't afford to hire a narrator. They tend to be very expensive. And the ROI on sales, because of distribution costs and all the rest of it, I would have had to sell way more copies than is likely in order to break even. So around the same time, AI narration was coming out, and my original concept was to clone my own voice. And I did that too and tried that out. But if I couldn't act, my clone voice could act even, more poorly. And so ultimately, I decided to try to use imitation voices. And I decided to try to overcome the acting element by assigning different voices to different characters so that the reader would be able to distinguish one from the other. And the hardest voice to nail down was Stanley's. Like, Stanley's voice was really hard to nail down because, he had to be kind of wheedling, and some of the baritone voices didn't work, and it was hard to get Stanley.
No, I'm sure. I mean, it was hard to get Stanley on a lot of levels, but I can completely appreciate, I do have a theater background, a drama background, and I can completely appreciate what you're saying. And yes, you're right. You needed Stanley to be snivelly enough, but also have some semblance of, dare I say, humanity. But I think you did a really good job. And it must have been an interesting process to make those choices, to assign a voice to these characters who essentially lived in your own head, right? So very cool, and to make that connection. So no, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So thinking about the process of creating a novel to put out there, and thinking about the topic of medical assistance in dying, which has been big for our country. That's probably one of the understatements of the year. And Keri Lynn and I often talk about this from our very first research project that we did. We started in 2017 when MAiD had just been legalized. And our thoughts, our experiences, our knowledge have really sort of helped us to develop our thinking and our understanding around medical assistance in dying. And I'm wondering, did you have any changes in your perceptions or your learnings as you unpacked this book, as you crafted Hetty's journey throughout it?
Tons. Specifically about MAiD, what I really learned was that there's a very narrow window between when a MAiD death becomes psychologically feasible and still physically possible within the parameters of the law. And so what I mean by that is that with the various experiences, particularly with cancer deaths, there's a frenetic energy after somebody's diagnosed, while they're going through tests and treatments and, recovery and care and all that sort of stuff. But it's all sort of underpinned by hope. And that hope keeps people moving forward. And at some point, when there is no more hope, that's when that window opens. Because before that, MAiD isn't really sort of talked about. It's not even thought about because the focus is on curing the disease rather than accepting that one's death is imminent. And so the window opens when the person is told that there's no more hope. And then it closes again because often the cancer will affect people's competence. And if they can't give final consent, and I know that final consent, there are new rules around it, but that all assumes that you started the process. And, and so with final consent, it's a very narrow window, and sometimes it's shorter than people think. And so if I can get some information out there about MAiD and that window, then when the time comes, then maybe people will make that step sooner.
I love that. And we often talk about that in the field of palliative care, the trajectory of hope and hope being on a continuum. And because we're talking so much about books today, you reminded me of a book that my friends have just released over the last year, Sammy Winemaker and Cian Sao. And the title of their book is On Hope, Hope for the Best, but Plan for the Rest. And I think that's that idea of two flowing trajectories, or I'm an artsy-fartsy person, two rivers is kind of how I see it, and how they can complement each other. You can continue to hope for a cure and that things are going to be okay, but you can put your planning in place. And maybe that looks like advanced care planning, thinking about after-death care. Maybe MAiD is, for some people, a part of that, but it also means upstream work and educating ourselves about what options are available for us at the end of life. And I think your book is such a good tool for that, Marcy, because it's fiction, because it's a novel, because it's something that people can read and digest in a way. And you said 65 chapters, and I stopped myself. I read it on a electronic reader. So when the chapters came up, but I never felt like it was 65 chapters. The flow, it was a very accessible read. So I'm wondering, what kind of feedback are you getting from people who've read your book? What have you been hearing?
Well, people seem to be appreciating it. I'm getting lots of positive feedback and reviews, and some people are stating their opinions publicly, and lots of people are sending me emails and text messages and things like that to tell me what they think. Some of the best feedback I'm getting are from people who have told me that they've taken action in their own lives. And to me, that's just very important. And so you know about the one couple who have chosen to apply for, well, they both applied for MAiD deaths. He was accepted, she was not at this point, but they both did it after each reading my book. And lots of people have told me that they've updated their wills and, to avoid Hetty's disastrous situation.
And I love that, right? That a novel can be a catalyst for further discussion, to get people to think about it, because the conversations around dying, death, loss, and grief can be challenging for many people. And a novel allows us to say, hey, I read this really cool story, and this is what I'm thinking about it. You please go read it, and let's have a conversation, and let's talk about where it hits for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
I think, too, what I love about your book and what Kathy has just kind of, what I've inferred from what she said is I think because you chose fiction, I think it serves up a more palatable version of having those bigger conversations so that my septuagenarian mother, who's in a book club, would read your book. Oh, we read fiction and and we're going to pick up the book. And because fiction gives you that little kind of zone of comfort, because I'm not reading the raw, necessarily the raw story, as you say, the memoir of Marcy Lane. What I'm reading is a story. And what's so interesting about that is Kathy and I talk a lot about the power of language. And by calling something fiction, even though it it comes up, it bubbles up out of you as a real, very real person with very real experiences. It cloaks it in something, as I say, a little bit more manageable for we squishy humans who are becoming more and more distanced from dying, death, and loss in our society, right? I want to continue on with Kathy's question because, your book is, getting support from people outside of Canada. And Kathy and I often talk about how the world is watching MAiD legislation in Canada and what goes on in this country in terms of that MAiD legislation. Let's turn the question around, though, and say, wonderful that you're receiving feedback, but what are you hopeful for as the author of A Mercy of Widows? What are you hopeful for in terms of the takeaways that your readers will get from your novel?
I'm hoping that people will understand death, dying, grief, MAiD more, and make some important decisions before it's too late, so that everybody can carry on their trajectories the way that is most helpful for them and healthy for them. I've seen too many people mired for way too long in the grieving process, and lots of that could have been avoided if their dying loved one had handled things differently. And so as part of my own recovery, I was part of a grief group, and I still remain friends with some of those people, even though it's more than a decade later. And I was truly shocked by how ill-prepared their dying loved ones were for the outcome. And it left these people, mostly women, in quite a pickle. And in some cases, those pickles are still not resolved. And so if people can avoid those kinds of situations, I would consider my book a success.
Well, I think already, as a reader of your book, I definitely, I dwell in these spaces all the time. I would like to think that I'm quite grief literate. And of course, I learned from your novel things that I really hadn't contemplated for myself. So I think my pickle's getting sorted before it gets too vinegary. But I think also, I think that's really interesting what you say about how there's this decade where, your experience personally, and you're seeing people really in similar circumstances, but really facing complex issues to try to navigate. I have been a student of Kathy's since 2018, 2017. And one of the things that I hang on to is that Kathy has taught me that how we die matters, but how we die matters for the people who are left behind. And your novel really, really reinforces that idea. So yeah, fantastic. I love that idea. If your success marker is that somebody makes an attempt to, get in touch with Speak Up Ontario or make some plans about how they want their palliative care end of life to look like, then that's fantastic. So on that note, and as a person who writes fiction, is there another project for Marcy Lane on the horizon? Have you finished writing about MAiD? Or is that, as you say, is that window still open?
I'm not currently writing any more on MAiD, except probably some nonfiction pieces. Yeah, probably no more fiction pieces on MAiD. I am working on 2 projects right now. One is almost purely fun. It's a bit of a lark, and it's a cozy mystery. The other one is a lot more serious, and it's a nod to my late husband, who was born and raised in Haida, which is, where Haida is. It's an archipelago north of Vancouver Island. And he always considered that place home. And so the second novel is exploring the nuances of the cleft between cultural appreciation and appropriation of Indigenous art.
Yeah. So
that's my more serious one.
I look forward to reading that one too. Yeah, that gave me goosebumps as somebody who's been to the Queen Charlotte's and had a chance to see some of the amazing artwork of the Haida Gwaii. So I'll look forward to that one. And I hope, Marcy, my hope is that even if novelists and writers aren't as brave as you were to craft an entire novel around medical assistance in dying, I hope people in the arts fields will incorporate it in and weave it into their work. that it becomes a part of life that we normalize and socialize through its presence in all aspects of art and music and literature. And so maybe it's not a book that is, I would say, as groundbreaking as yours to bring it into the fiction field, but it becomes something that we're used to hearing about, that we are increasing our discourse around that by seeing MAiD written in obituary, that we're having important conversations about it as communities, as families, in education systems. And so then it becomes a part of our art as well. And I want to say thank you for leading that in Canada in terms of the first novel that I've heard of that MAiD was a central character, because it really was a character in your book, because we got to learn more about it. And Marcy, finally, was there something we missed that we should know about your novel? What do you want people to do next? How can they engage with you?
Well, I always love readers to connect with me. I love hearing what people have thought about the book, and if they are looking for advice or whatever about MAiD connections, I've helped a few people in that regard as well. One of my best experiences so far as a new writer has been joining book clubs. I love joining book clubs. That is so fun. And so if people have a book club that wants to feature my book somehow, it's available in several libraries. So, people can acquire it that way. It doesn't have to be a bought book club purchase, but I would love to zoom in and talk with them. And other than that, if people want to join my readers group, that's excellent too. And that's at marcylane.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, Marcy, for your time and for our discussion today. We've really appreciated it.
I've really enjoyed myself, and thank you so much for putting this together. This is a wonderful program.
Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. So many things we got to talk about from the book that we both, and Sadie, the three of us enjoyed.
And isn't that great? I have to say, that's one of the perks of doing this podcast, is that we get to connect with people doing really fascinating things in the MAiD space. And just in case you couldn't tell, I love the idea that MAiD is now in our fiction literature as kind of almost a character of itself. And I really appreciated the characters in this book. And it made me feel like they were people I knew, people who I understood, Canadians, and challenges that we're facing each and every day.
Yeah, I really like that. I loved when you said that about MAiD itself being a character, because I think you're right. It's like those novels that you read where, the building is part of the cast of characters, because the space is so important. MAiD is so important and so integral to that novel in myriad ways that you're right. It takes on, I would argue, maybe even a few characters because of the different experiences. I also like too that we get to really kind of explore that idea that just as a member of the LGBTQ plus communities, in the early days when there were novels written, we were the kind of sidekick character, right? The gay best friend, or that lesbian couple that, is looking for a donor, and now we don't have to be, let's write a book and make sure there's a queer character. It's like we're a lot more, you use the word normative, or like a lot just sort of there. I think you're right in the thinking that MAiD will become less a sort of, this is what the subject is, because of books like Marcy's, where MAiD is front and center rather than kind of that, and that's the sort of add-on. I think that's really cool.
And as I think we hear in our research, that MAiD was one of the options that people chose to utilize at the end of life. But they were people first, and they lived hopefully a long and full life, and had experiences and loved people and did exciting things. And MAiD just happened to be what they chose because it fit with who they are. And so I think we'll probably see moving forward that MAiD is interwoven into the landscape of fiction.
I think that's cool. It reminds me of the work we do with digital storytelling, where it's not the story. It's just a story, and in all the stories that collect to make us the humans that we are, right?
Yeah.
Excellent.
And so if our listeners are looking for a story that features medical assistance in dying, but really is about people and the essence of people as they move through and alongside difficult parts of life and living, of which dying and death is part of. Please do pick up A Mercy of Widows. Do yourself a favor and engage in some fiction reading that I think you'll find bits and pieces of things that will hit hard and that you'll relate to.
Absolutely. Pick up a copy and then get in touch with Marcy Lane, the author, and keep these conversations that disrupt death going.
Until next time.